Thanks for having me. This is my first international conference in like 2 years, which is extremely exciting for me. I'm sure it's the first conference for quite a while for some of y'all too, that's at least in person. So I hope you're as pumped as I am to be here much earlier than I'm usually out of a hotel room when I am in a foreign country. But this is the DevOps Revolution. We haven't always known everything. And after I'm done, I hope you keep thinking about what I'm about to say over the next few days. I hope you take it with you back to work. Some of you are almost certainly in a position to put some of these things into practice. And I would really appreciate it if you did for the people that come after us. But before I start, while I'm talking about myself on the next slide, I want you to try to remember what it was like to be new to tech before you were considered an expert in anything. I want you to sit there and think about how every new thing you learned felt a little bit different. Some things that you learn now are easier because they've built on the things you've learned before. Some things are still hard, but we do tend to kind of forget what it's like to not be an expert, and it leads to some problems. So, first up is me. My name is Cat Cosgrove. That's my cat, Espresso. She really loves attention, and she writes most of my tweets. She's very cute. But I'm a staff developer advocate at Pulumi. And before I was a developer advocate, I spent several years as a software engineer. I did a whole bunch of different stuff, but my first job fresh out of a boot camp was as an embedded Linux engineer, which sounds pretty lofty for a boot camp grad, I guess, but I did okay. I was, however, immediately thrust into a very, very fast-paced environment where I needed to become functional in quite a lot of different tools and technologies and workflows that I had never, ever, ever been exposed to before. Most boot camps just teach you how to be a web developer, right? And I was definitely not doing web development very suddenly. I had freelanced as a web developer for a couple years before that, but this was nothing like building people like WordPress or Joomla sites for local small businesses or gyms or whatever. So it was overwhelming to say the least, and it taught me some interesting things. Before I go any further, though, if you would like to get a hold of me later, that is super easy to do. You can find me on Twitter at Dixie3Flatline. You can also try emailing me at cat@pulumi.com, but I will warn you that I do not respond to emails with like any real level of urgency. So it's not your best bet, probably. There will also be plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So if you don't get me then, just get a hold of me online and I'll be happy to answer you. Anyway, when I was an embedded Linux engineer, we were building a proof of concept demonstrating that fast over-the-air updates for cars, rather than the manual updates in a service center that most cars use now, were possible. You might be thinking to yourself, oh, my Tesla updates over the air, this is a solved problem. And that's true that your Tesla does update over the air, and it is a solved problem for Teslas and for, I believe, some BMWs now, but for the overwhelming majority of cars, this is not a solved problem, and it is a huge, huge pain. So it was very cool. It was solving a very real technical problem, and I was also way, way, way out of my depth. In just a couple of months, I had to learn all of these technologies on the slide here, which is, Kubernetes, which I learned via K3S, ZeroMQ, Helm, Mender, Yocto, Lava, TensorFlow, and a whole new programming language in Go, because at the time I only really knew Python and JavaScript super well. And I would not have been able to do this if I didn't have a manager who really trusted me and a tech lead who was not just willing to help, but enthusiastic about helping, because that's his job. If he's watching this, probably not. Hey, Brennan, call me. Anyway, none of this was actually easy to learn, and I don't think that that's because I don't have a degree in computer science. I did go to college, but not for computer science, and also I dropped out. And it's not because I'm not smart enough, or because these things are just always difficult no matter who you are. I don't think any of these things actually has to be difficult to learn. The problem is the way we talk about these things and the way we teach them. But I will go into that a little bit more later. So let's say before I get into this, that we're going to make sure everybody is on the same page. I know that this is a very DevOps heavy conference, and I can probably assume that you all know what that means, but to err on the side of safety and to not be a hypocrite during my own talk, this is the definition of DevOps I'm going to be running with. DevOps is the term for the union of the development team and the IT operations team through the use of a specific set of practices and tool chains with the ultimate goal of shortening the software development lifecycle and delivering more high-quality software. Got it? Seem reasonable? So in order for DevOps to work, we need two things. We need tooling, and we need a culture shift. You can't just drop DevOps tooling into a 1980s-style tech enterprise and expect it to work. You need to change the culture there, too. This is an established fact. It's also still the topic of a ton of conference talks about DevOps, while more and more companies move over from older methodologies to the way we do things now. I'm not going to go into this a ton because much more qualified people than me give outstanding talks on this very subject, probably at this very conference, and you should go listen to them. But to give context within the scope of this specific talk, for developers, DevOps might mean changing the way you write software. Your code gets written in a way that's a bit more modular, which makes it easy for other people to maintain, because ultimately other people are maintaining it. I know it can be tempting to cram some really complex logic into one line, but not only is the next person to maintain that not going to know what you're doing there, when you go back and look at it 6 months later, you're probably not going to remember what you were doing there either. So you're kind of just causing problems for everybody at that point. You need to be merging with source and pulling from main often, multiple times a day ideally, and you make much smaller changes each time, right? So you have build tests and unit tests run with every single commit, and that whole process gets automated by some CI/CD solution. If an entire team is doing this, conflicts happen less often, and failures get discovered much, much earlier, which lets you fix them immediately. So developers don't exist in a silo anymore. Everybody has to do DevOps to some degree. The cultural shift here can take some getting used to. Teams do struggle with it a little bit at first, but you're more efficient, you're less stressed out, because a lot of the things you were doing manually before get automated. But the point I'm trying to make here is that an understanding of DevOps practices and tooling is not the exclusive domain of people with the word DevOps in their job title. It is everybody who touches either side of this equation, or else it does not work. It's just a slog. It's not just DevOps engineers, it's not just SREs or release managers or whatever you call them at your company. It's not just whoever's managing your infrastructure. And all of this stuff is actually kind of new in the grand scheme of things. DevOps as a term has existed for about 10 years now. I think it was first coined at DevOps Days in Ghent, and that's been about a decade since that DevOps Days. The first commercially successful serverless platform was AWS Lambda in 2014, and now there's more of them than you can shake a stick at. We're drowning in them. And we've also got some serverless databases hanging around now, just for good measure. 4 years ago, Linkerd and the concept of a service mesh didn't really exist, but in 2021, it's hard for some people to imagine functioning without one. Our industry and our technology really, really rapidly evolved. We've got layers and layers and layers of abstraction between us and our code, and more teams across an organization are expected to have some level of familiarity with these things. So to you and to me, an expert, maybe with years of experience in the field and maybe a job title with the word DevOps in it, it's possible that this is a change that you haven't really noticed because you've been in it the whole time. You remember when these tools were first born. You remember the birth of the concepts that eventually led to these tools. You have context. You have adjacent domain-specific knowledge that makes picking up a new tool like one of the ones I mentioned earlier easier because you understand the why behind it. You get it. you have done without these things. You have personally experienced the very specific ways in which things were harder then. So a high-level definition of something like a service mesh is good enough for you. You just get it right off the bat, right? It's immediately clear how this tool could make your life easier. New grads and junior developers do not have that context. And there are a lot of them. And we really need them, it turns out. Here's some numbers. So these numbers are all from the US. Sorry, it's harder to get numbers for like the EU as a whole due to like differing university systems, but in the US, about 65,000 people graduate from a 4-year program in computer science each year, and that number is rising. If you add coding bootcamp grads, people like me, you get around another 23,000 out of it. And that's also rising rapidly, but much more rapidly than the 4-year grads. I don't have data for the number of self-taught developers entering the workforce each year. Obviously pretty hard to get that data, but we're already looking at nearly 90,000 junior developers in the market a year. It's a lot of new talent. It's a lot of new ideas, and we want that. We need new talent. We need new ideas. But it's actually not enough. According to data from CompTIA, last year in the US, there were 307,000 new tech jobs. That's astonishing. 123,000 of them were in Washington State, which is where I live. Now, that does include a wide variety of roles, obviously, and seniority levels, but it's still a huge number of positions open. It's massive. We don't have enough people to fill these roles. We just do not. Now, we don't know what these new grads are good at, and we don't know what they like. But we mostly agree that DevOps is a full spectrum, all or nothing thing if it's going to work to its best potential. Your junior devs are going to have to touch some of this stuff at some point, hopefully immediately, but at some point they're eventually gonna have to touch it, right? And it's better for all of us if they actually understand it, but we aren't exactly making that easy. Whether we realize it or not, the way we're doing things now is gatekeeping. It's unintentional and it's not malicious, but it is gatekeeping. So let's talk about that a bit. Gatekeeping is the act of preventing access to something like a career, a community, or a fandom unless specific and usually unreasonable requirements are first met. For example, consider a woman going to the card store to play Magic the Gathering on a Friday night. It's me, okay? If you don't know what Magic the Gathering is, it is a trading card game that's been popular since the early 90s with a notoriously very, very male, somewhat hostile player base. People are laughing, so that's good. I do actually play Magic the Gathering, and this did not actually happen to me, but it could. So assume that instead of just letting me hang out and play at Friday Night Magic, someone asks me to name the winning deck from every Magic the Gathering World Championship since 1994. That's an absurd requirement. So it's gatekeeping. It's malicious and intentional, though. It's also like a really outrageous example. I submit that there is a second type of gatekeeping. So if intentional gatekeeping is when we make an actual decision to take a real action with the express intent of forcing newbies to prove themselves in one way or another before being able to participate without applying that standard consistently, we've got a second type, passive gatekeeping. This accomplishes the same thing. We keep somebody out of a community, or we make it much harder for them to get in by requiring them to meet some bizarre standard. In my opinion, there are 4 ways we are passively preventing junior engineers from finding their place in DevOps: jargon, documentation, mentoring, and hiring. I'm going to start with my personal pet peeve, which is jargon. We use it rampantly in DevOps, and we have this like persistent assumption that everyone reading our content has been around since DevOps Days Ghent, and we all have a deep understanding of its history and its lore and all of its arcane tooling. And to illustrate this point, I'm going to present you with 2 pieces of jargon from things that the majority of you are not experts with. So, does anybody here fence? Any fencers in the room? Just one? Perfect. So fencing is an Olympic sport with 3 different styles, all of them with different rules: foil, épée, and saber. This is an actual sport, not a martial art. It's not HEMA, it's not sword fighting, and it's been around for a long time now. You may have seen it at the Olympics. And regardless of which weapon you fence, the definition of attack is always the same. And people who don't fence are almost never able to define it correctly. Take a moment and guess. Does anybody have an idea what attack means in fencing, other than the guy who fences? Cool. So you might think that an attack is any action intended to score a touch or a point against your opponent. That's not actually correct. The attack is the initial offensive action made by extending the arm and continuously threatening the opponent's target, preceding the launching of the lunge or flesh. On its surface, that kind of makes sense, even if you don't know anything about fencing. The words do go together. You understand that it's the first offensive action a fencer takes, so the first time maybe they stick their arm out, right? And if they're sticking their arm out and aggressively threatening the opponent without doing any like hedging or making a defensive move or whatever, before finally, what are those words at the end? Now you can guess at what a lunge is, because I assume everybody has at some point taken PE, like phys ed in school, and been told to lunge. But what does flesh mean? So here we have jargon in the definition of our jargon, but in this case, it's not actually a huge problem. Fencers do know what a flesh is, all of them, even the newbies, and this sport is very, very old. All the domain-specific terminology is established, and it has been for a really, really long time, aside from like some really specific weird circumstances where rules have changed recently in épée or saber, but that still doesn't change the definition of the words being used. This is one Google search. It's not a big deal to figure this one out. Fencing gets away with this, because in a lot of cases, the language used to talk about the sport hasn't changed in a century. DevOps technologies, however, are changing year over year. We have technologies to provide abstractions for technologies that are abstractions for technologies that didn't exist 10 years ago. That's a little bit out of control, and it's unreasonable to expect people to dig that far down. We can't do that and expect newbies to understand quickly, just like I can't expect you to understand the next example, which is either going to be easier for this crowd or harder. Goats. Does anyone know what that means in the context of video games? Anybody in the room? Excellent. I can't see the virtual audience, but I'm gonna assume that somebody in the virtual audience gets it. Hi, virtual audience. I want to talk to everybody who doesn't understand this one. Overwatch is a first-person shooter by Blizzard with a robust competitive professional scene. In Overwatch, the term GOATs refers to a specific composition of heroes playable in the game, originally consisting of 3 tanks, which are heroes that have a lot of health, who may move more slowly and don't necessarily do a ton of damage, and 3 healers, with 0 dedicated damage characters. The origin of this specific piece of jargon is kind of weird, though. You might guess that it stands for greatest of all time, which is a fairly common turn of phrase used to describe an athlete who's particularly talented. However, it actually refers to the name of a team by the same name who first popularized this composition and made a run through Overwatch Contenders, which was Blizzard's semi-professional league. It was unstoppable at the time, and so the composition was named after that team. This one is not user-friendly at all. This is an onion of jargon. Unlike the example from fencing, goats gives you zero indication of what it could possibly mean. So when Blizzard wanted to expand viewership of Overwatch League to a more casual audience instead of just diehard esports fans and actual Overwatch players, they set up like streaming partnerships with ESPN and Disney. They had to do away with the term goats. It was a barrier. So shoutcasters for matches were instructed to call the composition 3-3 because it means what it says. 3 tanks and 3 healers. You can figure it out. Instead of needing to spend a whole bunch of time reading lore about semi-professional Overwatch competitions from now like 4 years ago, to know what it means when somebody says, hey, let's go goats. Now, you can't actually go goats anymore. They did change the rules about how many heroes of what type you can play, but you still hear it. So mainstream esports is in its infancy. It's really, really young. And it feels like we get a new piece of jargon there once a month, especially if you're like watching it on Twitch. But it's easy for me to pick it up because I've been involved in esports for a long time. I played competitive Counter-Strike in high school. Just like it's easier for people with a decade of DevOps experience who've been there since the dawn of time to understand what a service mesh is. Not so for new folks trying to get into watching it casually or new engineers trying to get into DevOps. This term was a barrier for entry that did not need to be there. So they got rid of it. The same goes for DevOps. Like Blizzard and Overwatch League, if we want people to use our tools or move towards a more DevOps way of doing things at their companies, we have to make it involve fewer hurdles. We really just do. Just using more descriptive words or going out of our way a little to clearly define the domain-specific words we use the first time we use them can go a long way to making our things more approachable. An experienced engineer moving over from a completely unrelated field to yours or trying your tool for the first time should probably still be considered a newbie in some respects. So if we all put in just like a tiny bit more work to define the jargon when we use it and do away with things that don't make sense on the surface, we make our products and our ways of doing things far more easily adoptable, which makes all of our jobs easier, especially if you're me and you have to justify your salary to marketing. On to the docs. This is especially true when it comes to your technical documentation. Please have a quick start guide. That might sound obvious, but a shockingly large number of young open source tools that really want to succeed don't have them, even ones that are being incubated as part of some large foundation. That quick start guide needs to be written as if directed at someone with zero understanding of your tool. I know that also sounds obvious, but most of them aren't written that way. They're written by experts for other experts, and that is not helpful. This means that you need to give your reader the why for each thing that you are doing. Don't just tell me that your product facilitates service-to-service communications between microservices using a sidecar proxy. I don't know what that means. I do know what that means, but 4 years ago, I didn't know what that means. Tell me why that's useful. In practical terms, literally what problem are you solving for me? A technical definition is not the why. Linkerd is actually particularly good at this. I love their documentation. Their docs provide links out to explanations of relevant concepts and terms the first time they're mentioned, even if they have to go out to an external website, which is really, really cool. There is a step-by-step guide, and every single command you run is explained in extreme detail. It's great. I have one complaint about their docs. They use the word easy a lot in their docs. I don't like that in a technical context, and here's why. So easy, it turns out, is actually a super alienating term. If you use that word in technical documentation, like marketing copy is something else entirely. Go for it. I truly do not care. The engineers aren't reading your marketing copy anyway. You need to be damn sure when you use easy in your technical documentation that it's really actually easy, not just easy for you. And it almost certainly is not actually really easy. If this new talent that we want to be using our stuff doesn't find it easy when your documentation repeatedly says that it is, they're going to be discouraged. And I don't need to be struggling with imposter syndrome more than I already do. The reality is that none of this is actually easy until you're an expert, at which point we forget that it isn't easy, which is why we're bad at teaching it. Call something easy when it's not for an absolute beginner, and this is just kind of gatekeeping again. And you may be thinking, but Kat, it was hard for me. It's normal for these things to be difficult to learn. That's just the way it is. Why? So what if it was hard when you did it? Why does it have to stay that way? Why is struggling to learn all of this 40 tabs open so you can Google every third word in this tutorial that was supposed to be for beginners, only to get 7 steps into it and find out that you also need a functional understanding of like 3 different AWS services to follow the rest of the not so quick start guide? That's why is that considered normal? Why is that acceptable? It shouldn't be. It sucks. It's not fun. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of resources. And we can fix this by just being a tiny bit more considerate. Until DevOps trade schools and boot camps become a thing, or universities start teaching these technologies too, because currently they super do not, we have to take teaching this stuff into our own hands. Those 90,000 new grads a year need our help so that we can take advantage of their insight. Some people already have. There are a few great books out there. There are a ton of people doing workshops and a lot of content creators writing on sites like dev.to or Medium or whatever for products that they don't even own, companies they don't even work for. I do this just because I remember how frustrating it was to learn myself, but we aren't enough. We need help from y'all, from you individually, from your companies, from your orgs, from your team. So if you have the energy, mentor somebody in your spare time. It doesn't even have to be like a full-time thing. You know, make yourself available to answer questions. Make it clear that none of them are stupid. It's ubiquitous to us, but not everybody knows what Ansible is, right? Proactively teach them the way maybe you wish you had been taught, but more importantly, the way they want to be taught, the way they need to be taught. Ask them how they learn best. Everybody learns in a different way. Make it a junior on another team at your company, a new grad from a college or a boot camp local to you, some random person from Twitter, whatever. I answer technical questions on Twitter all the time, and it's satisfying, and you should try it. Now, I'm specifically talking to the seniors, plus, and the team leads in the room. I'm sorry for being mean here, but if you let your junior teammates struggle longer than necessary, not only are you being a crappy teammate, you are actively detrimental to your company. You are wasting time, and DevOps is about reducing time wasted. As a senior, one of your responsibilities is to mentor junior teammates. It is literally your job. Allowing things to continue as they are is actively not doing your job. Suffering isn't a rite of passage to DevOps excellence. Take care of your junior teammates, please. On hiring, you are not going to get a junior DevOps engineer with 5 years of experience in Kubernetes, Istio, Artifactory, Golang, Helm, Jenkins, Hyper-V, Perl, Azure, and on and on. First of all, that's a senior engineer at least. Second of all, it's probably more than one. And third, mastery in all of those things is a ridiculous requirement for anybody. You might think I was exaggerating, and I was, but like just a tiny bit. I combed through a bunch of job postings in Seattle while I was writing this talk, and some of the requirements were absolutely wild for a junior title. This is a screenshot of a job listing I found with the title of Junior DevOps Engineer. Junior. This was in the first page of results on Indeed. I did not have to look hard for this. I literally just searched Indeed for Seattle and Junior DevOps Engineer, and this is what I got in the first page of results. Reading all of these, I wonder if anybody actually knows what it means to be a junior. And this is, by the way, not from some like random tiny startup. This is from like a large consulting firm. Like they absolutely should know better. I would not qualify for this job. Okay, lots of people that you look up to would not qualify for this job. So imagine how this looks to an actual junior, okay? You and I know that this is outrageous, and we'll just apply to it anyway, right? But they won't. They don't know that this is outrageous. They have no experience, remember? They have no context. So they're gonna look at this job posting and go, wow, I'm not qualified for this. Maybe DevOps isn't for me. The requirements section of this was equally ridiculous, by the way. This is just the skills section. It's awful and it's discouraging, and this pushes away good people with a drive to learn who could be an asset to your organization because your expectations are unrealistic. And this might be an intentional attempt to underpay somebody with more experience. It might also be ignorance on part of the person writing the job rec. But the intent is irrelevant. The impact is what matters here, and the impact is that this is super alienating, and to people with more experience, it also looks absolutely ridiculous. So consider instead that the landscape for DevOps, and specifically for cloud native, is so outrageously large at this point that unless your job requirements are very, very narrow, anyone you hire is gonna have to learn some new tooling, probably a lot of it, honestly. I know you can't really see what's going on in this slide, and that actually helps illustrate my point. This is the Cloud Native Computing Foundation's landscape as of 2020. The 2021 is larger and more ridiculous looking, but it didn't fit on my slide in a way that was like, even vaguely readable. So instead of trying to hire juniors who already know everything there is to do the job on day one, because that's not a junior, juniors have to learn everything, focus first on hiring some seniors and tech leads who have the core skills and technologies that you want, as well as the ability to be good mentors. Get them onboarded super well, and then hire juniors based on how well they learn, not what they already know out of the box. Nobody likes a whiteboarding interview. Because, reminder, nobody gets a degree in DevOps. It doesn't exist. They do not teach a single ounce of this in college. We're all learning as we go here, including us. We're experts. We're still learning. We're just better at learning because we have more context. And we're more likely to try things first. So, each of the things I've talked about here, rampant use of jargon, documentation written like the user is already an expert, a lack of mentorship, and unrealistic hiring practices is preventing us from getting access to the 90,000 exceptional new talents available to us each year. And from making the best of the people we do have, honestly. Individually, each of these things is a barrier, but together they can be pretty catastrophic. This is a cultural problem within DevOps that absolutely needs to be addressed if we want to live up to our goals of delivering better software faster, at least. We can't claim to be a culture of collaboration and caring and cooperation if we're excluding anyone or forcing them to jump through hoops to participate. We just can't. DevOps exists so that we don't have to suffer through the same problems with writing and delivering software that we did before. Remember when it was reasonable to expect it to take like a year or more to get an update to a piece of software. Do you want that back? I don't. You know, every new tool and technique and strategy that we get exists to solve a pain point. So why are we allowing the problems with our culture to continue too? We're solving the problems with our software and we're ignoring the problems with people. But remember, DevOps is not just tooling, it's also a culture. We have to nurture that too. And as long as gatekeeping like this exists, we can't angrily reply, DevOps is a culture, not just a tool set, and turn our nose up at people on Twitter when someone thinks that CI/CD means DevOps without being hypocrites. And personally, I don't want to give up saying that snottily on the internet. So, here's what I'm asking from each of you today. I want you to remember what it was like to be new yourself. This might be difficult to do. Humans are really, really good at forgetting those things, and that's okay. But think about what you struggled with specifically and how that made you feel and how long it took you to feel like an expert in anything at all, if you ever did. Some people never do feel like experts. I have been forced to admit it after being repeatedly told I'm an expert in X, but I never really internalized that, and that's normal too. And think about the people around you, the people who helped you, or the people who ignored you. Then try to use that to change the way you speak to people, the way you write your technical documentation, the way you work day to day, and the way you hire. And make this a little bit better, please. Thank you for coming to my session. I am now around to take questions for about 14 minutes, if anybody has any, or I can just stand here and stare. What's up?
Thank you. Thanks for the talk.
Yeah.
That job ad that you showed that was ridiculous was for a junior role.
Yeah.
How would you correct that? How would you put together?
Well, let me back up to that slide.
What would you actually put on it so as not to scare people away?
So the issue here is that there's at least 2 or 3 different jobs on here. This is not just a DevOps engineer, and it's certainly not a junior DevOps engineer. There are too many responsibilities from different parts of what makes up DevOps for this to be a one-person gig, even for a senior. Like, the networking is functionally black magic for a lot of people. You know, it is for me. So this needs to be split up into 2 or 3 different job recs, I think. That is the problem. It's easier to get an understanding of how bad this is if I have like the whole job rec, but including the skills section, but I couldn't fit it on the slide. Also, 3 years of support or equivalent experience, including a customer-facing or customer support role. Why is that a requirement for a junior DevOps engineer? That flat out shouldn't be there, I think. But yeah, this was from a consultancy, so this was somebody who was going to be, you know, loaned out, but they're looking for a unicorn, and this unicorn doesn't exist. I genuinely think that this one was an attempt to get like a senior plus engineer and underpay the hell out of them. But it doesn't matter, it still looks bad. Yeah, I would say that this needs to be 3 different job recs.
Have you seen a job ad though that you feel like, yep, that's for junior?
Yeah, every once in a while I see one that's like very, very reasonable, but it usually comes from like very young, very cloud native companies that are like really entrenched in the culture from the beginning. And they have a good understanding of what a good job rec looks like for a DevOps engineer, and also considerably more patience. Cloud native companies are very good at letting you just kind of, it's a little bit Wild Westy in the cloud native space sometimes. So those are generally more flexible. If you reach out to me on Twitter, I will be happy to, or you can try to email me, but again, I'll be happy to send you some examples I found that were good when I was doing research for this talk. Yeah. Do you have some great examples of good documentation that I can use to sell to my team? Question from online. Yes, two. Linkerd's documentation, like I said, is pretty great. Also, the Django project, which is a Python web framework, also has truly excellent documentation. That's usually one of my default examples for, wow, this stuff is good. It's very helpful. It's very explicit. But for more like hard technical, weird DevOps-y abstraction technical docs, it's Linkerd. Linkerd has really excellent docs.
What was your worst interview experience for yourself?
Okay.
And what would you say to them with the knowledge that you have now?
The question was, what was my worst interview experience for myself, and what would I say to them with the knowledge I have now? It wasn't catastrophically bad, and I did get the job, but it was really annoying. I had gone through like 8 interviews with this company, 8 engineering interviews. So, I'd already had a couple of whiteboarding interviews, I'd had culture fit interviews, I'd talked to HR, and on and on and on. And I was told that this last on-site interview was going to be the final formality with the C-suite kind of thing. And so, I showed up looking nice, which is unusual for me. I was still wearing jeans, but I was wearing heels and a blazer. Give me some credit. But surprise, it was another whiteboarding interview. And whiteboarding interviews are a thing that I don't think I would tolerate one today. I think if I walked into a room and was asked to reverse a linked list on a whiteboard, I would walk out. Because first of all, come on. Second of all, nobody really does that in their day-to-day. Third, I spend a significant amount of my time when I'm writing code Googling stuff, and that's normal. What is the whiteboard proving? Unless it is a position where talking to people about a technical concept and explaining it on your feet is a critical part of the job, I don't think we should be doing them. So if I was interviewing as an engineer and I ended up in that situation again where, surprise, it's a whiteboarding interview, I would get up and leave. If I was interviewing for another position as a developer advocate, which is what I do now, I would, cheerfully do it because that's my job. It is part of my job to explain technical concepts while I'm standing up in front of a whiteboard. But if you threw a surprise whiteboard at me today, again, I would just leave. Which is maybe a little bit bratty, but.
Yeah, thank you for your talk in the first place, because I'm that new where you're talking about.
Oh, hi, welcome.
Hi. It was quite nice to see you explaining the challenges I had. And my question with regard to that is, what would you advise me as a junior?
Ooh, what would I advise you as a junior?
What can I do to solve this problem, in your opinion?
I think you should, if you're comfortable with it, aggressively ask questions. Good, excellent. Please, make your team leads work for that, okay? I never let myself get stuck for more than 10 or 15 minutes before I go ask for help. I am not shy about it, and somebody might think you're annoying for that, but it is going to waste way less time, and there's not really a benefit to you sitting there banging your head on the keyboard. Also, I would say that you should always read the documentation thoroughly before you even touch a thing. It can be really, really tempting to just dive in and search the docs every time you don't know what to do, but you're going to be a little bit more quick to figure out what's going on if you read the docs first. And also, to help while you're doing that, as you're reading the docs, every time something is unclear or you need to go out to another tab to Google something, make a note of it in another doc, and if it's an open source project, issue a PR back to the docs and fix those problems. As a junior, your perspective is still super, super useful. It's useful in ways that seniors can't be useful. So as you're reading through the docs, as you run into trouble using a new project, make note of every time you do and the thing you actually had to do to fix it, and submit it upstream.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Yeah. do you have suggestions to really onboard juniors in a company from day one? Onboarding depends on your company pretty heavily. I don't think any junior is ever going to get anything useful done within the first week of working, because they're just gonna be doing like paperwork, right? Paperwork and getting to know people and on and on and on. Everybody's like overwhelmed. Stress is high. They're not even gonna start to learn in week one. So try to keep the stress down as much as possible. Keep your expectations a little bit more realistic about when an engineer should be like actually contributing code or something. I wouldn't expect a junior to be contributing code for a couple of months. You know, there's a lot of learning to be done, and that's normal and okay, and I think it's better in general to make sure that your new engineers have a good grasp not just on your product, like understanding what your product does and why it's useful, but what the code base is like and what all of this other tooling you use is for. Because I mean, remember, if they're new, they probably have not used like any of the tools involved in your like CI/CD, or like if you're doing any kind of like vulnerability detection or whatever, they don't know what sneak is, you know? So they need time to learn in a low stress environment. I would just not be assigning them actual work tasks beyond do your onboarding paperwork and then learn for a month, and make sure that you check in maybe weekly with a one-on-one to make sure that everything is going okay, that they're not too stressed out, that they're not overwhelmed, or that they're not like chewing through everything super quickly and absolutely foaming at the mouth for more stuff to do. Some people go really fast. I did at this job, and I needed more stuff to do after like a week. But not everybody is like that. So this is a communication problem, largely. Got 4 minutes left, so I think there's time for like one more. You?
Thanks for your talk.
Yeah.
I was wondering, how do you feel that this kind of gatekeeping culture within DevOps compares to the situation in software engineering overall? And like, how do you feel that this situation has kind of evolved over the last several years?
So the question was about how the gatekeeping situation in DevOps compares with the situation in software engineering overall, which does also have like a pretty extreme gatekeeping problem. It depends on where you are in DevOps. To me, software engineering at large has a huge problem with gatekeeping in a lot of ways. And we see it magnified on Twitter because tech Twitter is so loud. But with DevOps, it can go one of two ways. You end up with the like super corporate enterprisey flavor of DevOps, where I think it can be radically worse because you also end up with the like old boys club mentality, and that is usually pretty toxic. But it can also be radically better. If you end up in like the cloud native flavor of DevOps, I have never in my life seen a tech community so hostile towards crappy people as the cloud native community. It is incredible. If you make anybody uncomfortable, or you treat anybody poorly, or you act in a way that is not like specifically designed to make this technology more welcoming to everybody, you are out. And there's not a second chance. And I think that's great because it's fostered a really, really kind, helpful, smart community just of people that genuinely don't want anything more than to make their stuff easier to use. And that's really cool. So I spend a lot of my time in the cloud native side of things and not so much in the like enterprise space. But yeah, it's split. It depends on where you are living. I just hide from the enterprise flavor as a result, which is harder and harder because I mostly work with Kubernetes, and that's gotten pretty enterprisey now. I think that's it for time. There's 1 minute left, so it's probably not enough for another question, but thank you so much, everybody who came here in person, and especially thank you to everybody who came online, because I know that we're all tired of virtual conferences, and I appreciate you sitting in front of your computer to watch me.